So, okay, a few more minutes, and then we're free again. So we just talked about basically general infrastructure as a service setups, right? So you have computing capabilities, you have storage aspects that can be associated with this, networking and the management components, and of course, as discussed here already earlier, is infrastructure as a service pretty much includes platform as a service in many respects. So a lot of the functionality that you find in those IaaS platforms like AWS and Azure also include features that you would consider more PaaS style, right? So that could include of course, databases, the AWS relational database RDS itself, function level computing or serverless computing as it's called. There will be another session on that one specifically, but also continuous integration and so on, analytics, and a lot of further features that are available as part of AWS specifically. So bear in mind, so every time you write infrastructure as a service, it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to run a server or a virtual machine, right? It could also mean that you use just platform as a service offerings by those vendors. So in some session we also look at AWS, so you get an overview a bit more of what they actually offer and how it's structured and how you could use it. Okay, one other concept that we need to talk about, because they will be becoming increasingly relevant, is the nature of the cloud system. So you maybe have a data center that is run on AWS, of course, but it may also be possible that you run your own cloud infrastructure locally. And all of it has, of course, certain reasons. So we talk about public cloud systems when we have a situation where we have a public hoster such as AWS, where you actually have multiple tenants, right? So you and an arbitrary number of different customers are customers of AWS. The private one is, of course, a single tenant situation where you set up your own complete cloud infrastructure and run it and maintain it yourself. Who would do those things, perhaps?
School.
Cool. They do, yes, but not for all their services, but a subset of, yeah. Who else would be a good candidate for those kind of problems?
Companies with enough money to do that.
Cool, yeah. You're spot on. What are those companies with enough money often? So there's
Microsoft?
Yeah, of course, right? They run. So I'm not sure
Service providers.
Sorry again?
The service providers themselves.
The service providers?
The service providers themselves, that's right, yes.
The Facebook, for example.
Facebook, they're big enough, right? So it's your point again, yeah. So who else? What other reasons would there be to run your own cloud environment? Apart from having the money per se.
Security.
Yeah. And which companies are particularly concerned about those things?
Privacy.
Privacy, security, yeah. By what kind of companies specifically?
Research companies, CERN have their own OpenStack cloud.
Yeah. So research can be the reason. That's right, especially if it's for profit. Yes.
Most like military and like this high government.
Right. Why are they particularly concerned about it?
Because they rely on it heavily and they have to have the control.
Yeah. So, and what do they want to avoid?
It's like everything.
Everything, yeah, okay.
So you have issues with the legality of things. So, for example, you might not be allowed to take oil data out of Norway, and then you would have to use a cloud service,
Very good.
and then you would have to be ensured that all your data is in Norway.
Perfect.
For example.
Perfect. That's another kind of a legal aspect which is related. Cool. Let's pick up on this one. That's a good one. So you may be legally required to do that, right? So what was the latest legislation that was relevant to that particular issue? Yeah.
GDPR.
Right.
And you would have to encrypt your data when it's outside or transferred outside of Europe.
Yeah. Exactly, right? So as a response to that, many companies actually need to set up some sort of cloud center in Europe just for the sake of satisfying GDPR, as opposed to providing my performance or whatever else. So it's a purely legal move, right? So that's a very good point. So thank you for making this one. Probably would have slipped by. But what I wanted to get at as companies that are particularly concerned is generally security, right? So because if you have a multi-tenant environment, you don't know how reliable AWS is, right? Sometimes they may go down as well. We don't know, right? GitLab goes well, which are kind of more on the SaaS side, but they went down, and you have no clue how and which data are basically exposed. And some companies simply can't afford to have their data exposed because that's their, claim to fame, right? So in classic, it's banks and insurances. So they would never use something like AWS or Azure or whatever else for customer data. So they always do it themselves. In worst case, run their own services, because it's always cheaper for them to run their own infrastructure than bearing the risk of actually having data leak, because that's from a publicity point of view, and then of course from a profit point of view, is disastrous. So rather minimize uncertainty, that's the main point, and invest maximally to avoid this. And the same for military as well, of course, right? They want to guard their secret more than they want to have control. I agree, but I think it's more important that they keep someone out. Right, so than anything else really. So yeah, cool. So we have those two extremes. So generally those guys we hardly see, right, the private cloud people, because they do their stuff on their own. What we will be dealing with mostly is, of course, public cloud environments. Still important to know, because you may in some stage in the future in the decision to actually perhaps make that call and say, hey, what about a private cloud environment as opposed to AWS, which is the obvious choice, of course, especially for startups and things like that. And then of course very predictable costs, right? Relatively cheap because you pay per use. Here you need to kind of hold the entire infrastructure at hand, right, ready, and you need to anticipate growth as well, which is really expensive, of course. So it's not something that any average company would be able to pull off. There's a reason for having data centers of that nature. There's always a combination of those. What is the what would be an example? When could hybrid cloud solutions make sense?
AWS or Amazon probably has their hybrid cloud, public cloud, and they probably have a separate cloud for themselves, or part of the cloud is just for them.
Yep. But also as a normal company, would that make sense? Hybrid cloud solutions, yay or nay?
Absolutely. Oh,
If two companies are
Collaborating? Yeah.
collaborating,
Yeah.
then it will, then hybrid cloud can be,
Oh, okay. Interesting idea. That's good. Okay. Never thought about that bit. There was something. Yep. You.
You could perhaps keep your database on a private cloud and have like applications on public cloud, I guess.
Okay.
To have a high, more secure than all.
your point?
I was going to say that.
Exactly that point.
More, you have your own
Yeah.
private cloud for your stuff, and then public cloud for
Cool.
other stuff.
Yep, that's generally a good prototypical use case. Thanks very much. Yes, exactly. So generally more customer-facing stuff on a public, infrastructure and so on, and everything that's internal-facing, accounting, but also sensitive data, of course.
Another question.
Then a private arrangement, please.
Is hybrid the most used by big companies?
If I knew. Companies are not particularly forthcoming with their choice of infrastructure. But no, there's some data about it, but I'll show you in a second. So, but there's a lot of unknowns. I think it's kind of more like a security by obscurity kind of approach, that you actually don't know in how far they actually run hybrid cloud solutions or private cloud solution, or just run it publicly. I think most companies actually use public cloud solutions because they are the cost of running a data center is prohibitive. It's just too expensive. But there is very specific kind of use cases where hybrid clouds like those ones are quite useful, and the private ones, of course, only for really big players. If we can look at the distribution later. You will actually perhaps be surprised or not. Any other comment?
Yeah. Oh, do we have a question?
Very immediate, we have one here. No, in front of you. That's it.
Oh.
we said that that you could have database in a private cloud and then rest in a public cloud. But like if you have a database in a private cloud,
Okay, so we're back online, I guess, to some extent. Okay, coming back to the different cloud types, like private, public, and hybrid. What do you think the market distribution is, respectively? So, and asked it by rank. Who thinks that private cloud solutions are the most popular ones? Who thinks that the public ones and hybrid ones are most popular? That's the question. So private cloud first. Who thinks private clouds are the most heavily used cloud deployments? Okay. Public ones, clearly on that one. Okay. And then hybrid lower. So do we assume that hybrid clouds arrangements are? Oh no. Who thinks that hybrid cloud deployments are more prominent than private cloud deployments? So hybrid and then private, okay. Who thinks the other way around? Private and then hybrid one? Right. So, so that's roughly the overview. Because that's always, don't take them always with a grain of salt, right? This is the stats, they have biases. I'm really careful in trusting them, but they give you some intuition. So they show you foremost the trends. So on the left side, we have different columns that show the different types of cloud deployments or data centers. So on the left side, we have data centers. Here the idea is, that's the classical approach, right? Housing your own servers, running them, perhaps some virtualization, sure, but generally not a cloud kind of deployment system, so not an IaaS solution. And the idea is, or the intuition is there, it's actually still quite dominating the market. So most companies are still somewhat conservative and run their own data centers, but it's on decline. The question is, where does it go to? Well, and as you see, well, clearly the public cloud deployments are really benefiting the most. So that's where you see the largest growth for now and in the future. And the second most one is indeed the private cloud deployment. So it's really banks, insurances, military, research institutions, all the kind of stuff you mentioned, basically. They shouldn't be underestimated because they have considerable load as well. So the hybrid approaches are somewhat underpronounced. They're kind of there, but not too heavily used. Again, I'm slightly critical that this is a representation of the true, situation, because there can be considerable incentive to actually hide as much information as you can about your private infrastructure as possible for security reasons. Because if you're in that bracket, most likely you have something to hide. So most likely you also hide something about the infrastructure. So that's why I don't trust the data 100%. You had some comment? Was there a comment question? Good, no. Okay. I think we discussed all this. So, right. Please.
Yeah. So in both ways, you're doing a lot yourself, like infrastructure and such. But what is it?
Well, when we talk data center, we think about it like a very classical approach, where it's really about managing servers yourself, right? Actually, literally having the servers and perhaps virtualizing some elements of it, but not having the flexibility of a cloud infrastructure with scaling up and down and aspects like this. That
you scale up, then you need to buy another server.
That would de facto be the case, exactly.
So the private cloud, what you do then?
You buy another server, but the point is you may also just hold capacity idle, right? So the idea is, if you have a company that runs multiple, for example, provides a number of web services, right? And you may not necessarily know which service gets the actual load. In a cloud system, you would be able to reallocate your CPU capacity, memory, and so on, flexibly to the load relative to the service, right? You have 10 services, and one of them is super popular in season 1, the other one is super popular in season 2, and so on. So, and the cloud environment would accommodate this and spin up, allocate more resources, for example, for this particular service. In a data center setting, it would be more like how you actually configured it, right? So in the first place, so you have 10 machines for 10 services and so on. But if you want to reconfigure it in order to accommodate, for example, different load situations, that it would be traditionally more tedious, right? Of course, cloud solution can be run on top of data centers, but the term data centers here refers to more traditional company setups, where they say, oh, cool, we need to have an email service, let's put one server there. Oh, we need to have a customer relationship management system, or let's set two, associate two servers with this one, and so on, right? So it's more like the classical in-house approach where you see that companies actually run their own 20 servers for their 20 applications. That's the kind of idea there. Right? So it's fluent, of course, because you can easily say, hey, if I have this infrastructure, why don't I just dump cloud services on it? It may be possible. Sometimes there's certain constraints that the hardware that you're using is not as flexible to be virtualized. Because if you have, unlike in cloud environments, in data centers you may not have the fast network connectivity internally between machines, but only to the outside. Whereas in the cloud setting, you really virtualize everything from CPU to RAM, of course, to storage and so on. So your connectivity inside needs to be quite a bit different, quite a bit faster, right? So it's not as particularized for individual services, but rather more, this is an entire storage network that only deals with storage, irrespective of the VM that's associated with it. So architecturally, layout is quite a bit different. So it's not easy to convert a data center into a cloud infrastructure by just saying, I install the software and everything works. The hardware that's still underlying it, there is hardware, right? And needs to kind of accommodate this flexibility. That's the thing. But yeah, I think that would be more something for infrastructure courses to discuss, but we can pick this up as well. In fact, we should pick this up later when we talk about AWS, when we see more about the layout of this data center scale. So I think I'll leave it at this since we're running out of time, but that's fine. The only thing I want to say is that so cloud computing, one of the challenges in infrastructure as a service, platform and software as a service is that there's next to no standards. Right? So if you, and that can be a challenge for deployments, right? If you know Heroku, you deal with Heroku, you're locked in, right? So it's really hard to deploy this on a different PaaS service, right? If you are very comfortable using AWS to automate the deployment because you can do so using the APIs, that's the idea. If you do cloud computing, you're basically programming their infrastructure via APIs. You have a login effect as well, right? You're kind of tied down to Azure, to AWS, and so on. So it's something to be aware of. There's always the element of vendor login, but we have a set of de facto standards that are kind of crystallizing slowly. AWS, in some respects, we can talk about this. Docker is a de facto standard in this case, and so on. So it's something to be aware of if you were to be in the position whom you want to buy into, because once you invested into AWS, it's reasonably hard to move to another one. Then there are legal restrictions highlighted before, and strategic concerns, right? So, so that's something as well. So it may be driven from the company itself, but also simply legal concerns related to privacy in particular that are challenging. So originally I wanted to talk a bit about OpenStack as an example. We can do that in another session, but for now we leave it at this. So you have a rough overview of what IaaS is about, or how it's different rather from platform as a service.